Hello everyone and welcome back to WooEnglish. First, thank you for the incredible reaction to our previous Taiwan story. Yes, a few students could not see the questions before. Now they are fixed. You can find the full test in the first pinned comment. Today, we move to a new challenge. This story is level C1. It is deeper, more analytical, more precise. We will explore the fall of the Berlin Wall, not just as an event, but as a turning point in history. In this lesson, you will build advanced vocabulary, improve pronunciation, train structured thinking, and understand complex ideas in clear English. Listen carefully, think critically, and when you finish, take the test. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Wall of Concrete and Silence. Berlin, August 1961. The city did not wake up to the sound of celebration. It woke up to the sound of metal. In the early hours of the morning, while most residents were asleep, soldiers moved quietly through the streets. They carried rolls of barbed wire. They blocked roads. They sealed railway lines. They closed crossings that, only the day before, had been ordinary parts of daily life. By sunrise, Berlin was no longer one city. It had become two worlds facing each other. The official explanation was simple. The government of the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, declared that it needed protection. It described the new barrier as an anti-fascist protection wall. According to state propaganda, the socialist East was defending itself from the capitalist West. But this explanation concealed a deeper truth. For years, hundreds of thousands of East Germans had been leaving. They traveled through Berlin, which remained an open gateway between the Soviet-controlled East and the western sectors of the city. Doctors, engineers, teachers, students, many chose to cross. They were not escaping bombs. They were escaping limitation. Their departure threatened the stability of the East German state. So the government acted. At first, the barrier was temporary. Barbed wire cut through neighborhoods. Families discovered that the street they had crossed every day was now forbidden territory. Windows facing West Berlin were boarded up. Public transport routes ended abruptly. Friends waved at each other across armed patrols. Confusion turned into shock. Shock turned into realization. This was not temporary. Within months, the barbed wire evolved into concrete. Thick slabs replaced wire fences. Guard towers rose above rooftops. Floodlights illuminated what became known as the death strip, a wide, empty space designed to prevent escape. The wall was not merely a structure. It was a system. It included alarms, patrol dogs, trenches, and strict orders. Border guards were trained to prevent crossings. Attempting escape became a dangerous act. Some succeeded. Many were arrested. Others lost their lives. The wall changed the psychology of the city. On the western side, it became a symbol, a dramatic illustration of division in the Cold War. Politicians visited. Speeches were delivered. In 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy stood in West Berlin and declared solidarity with its citizens. The world watched. But in the East, daily life continued under quiet supervision. Schools taught loyalty to socialism. Media emphasized collective identity and suspicion of Western influence. Travel outside the Eastern Bloc required permission. Criticism of the government was risky. And yet, life was not frozen. People married, children were born, workers went to factories, artists created within boundaries. Many citizens believed in the ideals of equality and social justice that the system promised. Others complied outwardly while privately questioning. The wall created not only separation from the West, but also separation within the self. Public speech and private thought were not always the same. As years passed, the structure grew more sophisticated. By the 1970s, it was a complex barrier system stretching approximately 155 kilometers around West Berlin. Its presence became normalized. A generation grew up knowing no other reality. For them, the wall was not a sudden shock. It was geography. But normalization does not erase contradiction. The contrast between East and West was visible. Western television signals reached many East German homes. Images of consumer goods, travel opportunities, and political pluralism entered living rooms quietly. Comparison became inevitable. The East German government insisted that stability required control. It argued that ideological purity depended on boundaries. Yet boundaries can also create pressure. The wall was built to prevent collapse. Ironically, its existence highlighted insecurity. A confident system does not need to imprison its population to retain loyalty. Still, in 1961, few predicted that this structure would one day fall. It appeared permanent. Concrete has weight. Guard towers have authority. Propaganda has repetition. And repetition can feel like truth. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall stood as the most visible symbol of a divided Europe. It represented 2 political visions confronting each other across a narrow strip of land. But beneath the surface of concrete, history was moving. Ideas travel even when people cannot. Doubt accumulates even in silence. And systems built on restriction must constantly defend themselves against the human desire for movement. In 1961, the wall rose quickly. It divided families in a single night. What no one yet understood was that the same forces that required its construction might one day demand its destruction. The wall began as a solution. But in history, solutions can become problems. And problems, if left unresolved, eventually demand change. Chapter 2. Life Behind the Curtain. Berlin did not collapse after the wall was built. It adjusted. On the eastern side, morning still began with alarm clocks, factory whistles, and the quiet rhythm of trams moving through gray streets. Children walked to school carrying books stamped with state approval. Workers entered concrete buildings where production quotas were displayed on large boards. Order was visible everywhere. The government of the German Democratic Republic insisted that stability required discipline. Newspapers repeated familiar phrases about solidarity, collective responsibility, and vigilance against external threats. Television programs presented carefully selected narratives. The message was consistent. The socialist state provided security, employment, and equality. And for many citizens, this promise was not meaningless. East Germany offered guaranteed work. Housing was assigned, education was accessible, medical care was structured and affordable. In contrast to the unemployment and inequality often associated with capitalism, the state portrayed itself as protective and rational. Yet protection came with supervision. The Ministry for State Security, known widely as the Stasi, operated quietly but extensively. Its network of informants penetrated workplaces, universities, apartment buildings. Conversations that seemed private could be reported. Letters could be opened. Files accumulated. The presence of surveillance did not always manifest dramatically. It functioned through uncertainty. people did not necessarily know who was observing them. That ambiguity shaped behavior. Public speech became cautious. In offices and classrooms, citizens learned to repeat official language fluently. In kitchens, behind closed doors, conversations shifted tone. Humor survived. Doubt circulated. But it circulated discreetly. The wall itself reinforced this psychological division. From certain streets in East Berlin, one could see the western skyline. The Fernsehturm television tower rose proudly in the east, symbolizing modern socialist engineering. Across the divide, neon advertisements and commercial signs illuminated West Berlin. Contrast required no explanation. Western television broadcasts often reached Eastern households despite government attempts to restrict access. Families gathered quietly to watch foreign news programs or entertainment shows. They observed consumer goods displayed casually: cars, fashionable clothing, travel advertisements. These images did not immediately produce rebellion, but they complicated the official narrative. If the East represented fulfillment, why did so many desire departure before 1961? If the system was secure, why did it require a barrier? Such questions were rarely expressed openly. Yet, they existed. Economic reality also introduced tension. Although East Germany maintained one of the stronger economies within the Eastern Bloc, inefficiencies accumulated. Central planning struggled to respond flexibly to demand. Shortages of certain goods became familiar inconveniences. Waiting lists for apartments or automobiles extended for years. Still, daily life contained routine normality. Young people attended universities. Scientists conducted research. Artists produced literature and theater that operated within defined limits. Some genuinely supported the socialist project, believing it offered an ethical alternative to Western consumerism. It would be simplistic to describe the population as uniformly oppressed or uniformly loyal. Human societies are rarely so clear. Instead, there existed layers of adaptation. Some citizens embraced ideology sincerely. Others complied pragmatically. A few resisted quietly. Escape attempts continued throughout the 1960s and 1970s, though the fortified wall made them increasingly dangerous. Each failed attempt reinforced the seriousness of the boundary. Border guards themselves lived within this structure of expectation. They were trained to prevent unauthorized crossings. They were instructed to protect the state. Many were young men performing compulsory service, navigating their own moral ambiguities. Thus, the system sustained itself not only through concrete, but through participation. Participation does not always imply enthusiasm. Often, it reflects calculation. Stability, even constrained stability, can appear preferable to uncertainty. Yet beneath the apparent order, change was occurring beyond East German control. Globally, the Cold War entered new phases. Economic globalization accelerated. Technological advancement increased the speed of information. Western Europe deepened integration through institutions that emphasized cooperation rather than confrontation. Meanwhile, within the Soviet Union, the ultimate guarantor of East German authority, structural weaknesses intensified. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the gap between official rhetoric and lived experience widened. Younger generations, born after the wall's construction, possessed fewer direct memories of pre-division Germany. For them, The question was not whether unity would be restored, but whether the existing arrangement offered genuine opportunity. The state responded cautiously. It maintained order. It adjusted policies incrementally. It continued to emphasize ideological vigilance. But vigilance requires energy, and systems dependent on constant defense eventually encounter fatigue. In East Berlin apartments, citizens developed a quiet skill, navigating boundaries without confronting them directly. They cultivated personal spaces of autonomy, music collections, literature circles, church communities. Religious institutions, in particular, provided limited areas where discussion could occur with slightly greater openness. Small conversations accumulated. Not protests, not yet, but conversations. The wall had been built to prevent physical movement. It did not eliminate intellectual comparison, nor could it entirely suppress aspiration. By the mid-1980s, an underlying question had begun to circulate more visibly. Was permanence truly permanent? The structures of control remained intact. The Stasi files continued to expand. The border installations stood solid and illuminated. And yet, history was shifting quietly. Behind the curtain, life appeared stable. But stability can mask tension, and tension, even when managed carefully, has a habit of seeking release. Chapter 3: Cracks in the System. The wall still stood. Concrete remained solid. Watchtowers remained occupied. Border lights still cut through the night. And yet, something was changing. By the mid-1980s, the Cold War no longer felt frozen. It felt unstable. Across Eastern Europe, political systems that had once appeared rigid began to show signs of fatigue. Economic stagnation deepened. Public confidence thinned. The language of certainty no longer sounded convincing. In Moscow, a new leader emerged. Mikhail Gorbachev did not speak like his predecessors. He introduced two words that would echo far beyond the Soviet Union: glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. These were not revolutionary slogans. They were presented as reforms meant to strengthen socialism. Yet reform, by definition, acknowledges weakness. And once weakness is admitted, control becomes more complicated. East Germany observed these developments carefully. Its leadership under Erich Honecker remained cautious and resistant. The official position emphasized continuity. Stability was still the declared objective. Reform was viewed as unnecessary, even dangerous. But influence cannot be entirely contained. As the Soviet Union experimented with greater transparency, citizens across the Eastern Bloc began to reconsider what was possible. If Moscow permitted discussion, why should silence persist elsewhere? Meanwhile, economic realities became more difficult to conceal. Industrial production in East Germany continued, but innovation lagged. Infrastructure aged. Consumer goods remained limited in variety and availability. Comparisons with West Germany intensified, particularly as media exposure expanded. Comparison is a subtle force. It does not shout. It accumulates. In 1989, a seemingly minor event in Hungary created unexpected consequences. The Hungarian government began dismantling its border fence with Austria. Officially, the action was framed as technical modernization. In practice, it opened a pathway. East Germans vacationing in Hungary recognized the opportunity. If they crossed into Austria, they could reach West Germany. At first, the numbers were small. Then they grew. Families packed discreetly. Cars traveled south instead of north. News of successful crossings circulated quietly, then more widely. The wall still divided Berlin, but escape routes were multiplying elsewhere. Within East Germany, public gatherings increased. In Leipzig, citizens assembled in churches for prayer meetings that gradually evolved into discussions about reform. These gatherings were not initially confrontational. They focused on dialogue, on modest demands for travel rights and transparency. Yet, gathering itself was significant. Authoritarian systems rely on isolation. When individuals stand together, isolation weakens. By the autumn of 1989, Monday demonstrations in Leipzig attracted thousands. Participants carried candles rather than weapons. They marched calmly, chanting, "Wir sind das Volk," "We are the people." The phrase was direct. It did not attack. It asserted. The government faced a dilemma. Force had been used in the past. Suppression was possible. Security forces were trained. The Stasi remained operational. But international conditions had shifted. In June 1989, the world had witnessed violent repression in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. The memory was recent. Images had traveled globally. East German authorities understood that similar action would attract immediate scrutiny. More importantly, the Soviet Union no longer guaranteed unconditional military backing. Gorbachev signaled restraint. The so-called Brezhnev Doctrine, which had justified intervention in Eastern Bloc states, was effectively abandoned. Without external reinforcement, internal repression became riskier. Crowds expanded. In Leipzig, demonstrations grew from thousands to tens of thousands. In Berlin, similar gatherings formed. Protesters demanded freedom to travel, freedom to speak, and genuine political reform. These were not abstract ideals. They were practical aspirations. The language of loyalty began to compete with the language of accountability. Within the ruling Socialist Unity Party, divisions appeared. Some members recognized that change was unavoidable. Others insisted that firmness would restore order. But firmness requires consensus, and consensus was dissolving. On the streets, something subtle yet profound occurred. Fear began to recede, not disappear, recede. When thousands walk together, individual anxiety is redistributed. Responsibility feels shared. Courage becomes collective. The wall still stood physically intact. Guards remained at their posts. Official speeches continued to emphasize stability. Yet the psychological foundation of the system was eroding. Authority depends not only on enforcement, but on belief. When belief weakens, enforcement must increase. When enforcement increases excessively, legitimacy declines further. This cycle had begun. By October 1989, Erich Honecker was removed from power. His successor promised reform, but the pace was unclear. Citizens had already moved beyond patience. They had seen borders open in Hungary. They had observed reform in Poland. They had heard new rhetoric from Moscow. Why should their own system remain unchanged? The wall, once constructed to prevent collapse, now symbolized stagnation. Concrete had not cracked visibly. But structures do not fail only through physical fracture. They fail through accumulated doubt, institutional hesitation, and collective realization. By late 1989, East Germany was no longer defined solely by control. It was defined by momentum. Momentum is difficult to reverse. It gathers quietly. It accelerates unexpectedly. And once it surpasses resistance, even the most fortified barriers must confront a new reality. The wall still stood, but it no longer felt permanent. Chapter 4. The Press Conference. On the morning of the 9th of November 1989, the wall still stood. The watchtowers remained occupied. The checkpoints remained controlled. The border regulations remained strict. Yet inside a government building in East Berlin, uncertainty was spreading. The leadership of the German Democratic Republic understood that pressure was increasing. Demonstrations had not disappeared. Citizens continued to demand travel rights and political reform. International attention was focused on the country. A solution was required, or at least the appearance of one. That afternoon, officials prepared new travel regulations. The proposal was cautious. It would allow East Germans to apply for exit visas more easily. The process would remain bureaucratic. Approval would still be necessary. The intention was gradual relaxation, not immediate transformation. Language was drafted carefully. In systems built on control, wording matters. At approximately 6 p.m., a press conference began. Journalists gathered. Cameras were positioned. The atmosphere was routine, almost procedural. Government spokesperson Günter Schabowski sat at the table, prepared to read statements. The announcement about travel was included among several policy updates. It was not presented as revolutionary. It was administrative. Then a journalist asked a precise question. When would the new travel regulations take effect? Schabowski paused. He shuffled papers. He reviewed his notes. He hesitated. The document indicated that the regulation was intended to begin the following day, after necessary preparations. But in that moment, perhaps misreading, perhaps improvising, he responded, "As far as I know, effective immediately, without delay." The sentence was brief. The consequences were not. Television broadcast the statement live. Within minutes, the information circulated across East Berlin. People who had been watching the evening news turned to one another in disbelief. Effective immediately, without delay. The wording suggested that borders were open. Citizens did not wait for clarification. They moved. At first, small groups approached nearby checkpoints. They carried identification documents. They asked questions. Border guards, stationed behind barriers, were unprepared for such inquiries. The guards had received no updated instructions. Telephone lines became active. Officers contacted superiors. Superiors sought guidance from higher authorities. But communication within bureaucratic systems can be slow, especially during confusion. Meanwhile, the crowds expanded. News spreads rapidly when it carries hope. By 8 p.m., hundreds of people gathered at Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint. They were not aggressive. They were insistent. They demanded passage based on the announcement they had just heard. Guards faced a dilemma. Their training emphasized enforcement. Orders required control. Yet the situation did not resemble an organized assault. It resembled expectation. The officers asked for instructions again. What should they do? Allow passage? Refuse entry? Use force? No clear directive arrived. Time intensified pressure. The number of people increased. Chance began, not hostile, but determined. Citizens repeated that the government itself had announced the change. The authority of the wall depended on clarity. that clarity was dissolving. Shortly before 11 p.m. at Bornholmer Strasse, the commanding officer made a decision. Confronted with an expanding crowd and no explicit prohibition, he ordered the barrier lifted, initially to allow limited crossing, perhaps to relieve tension. The first individuals stepped forward cautiously. They presented passports. They passed through. They walked. On the western side, observers reacted with astonishment. Word spread quickly across West Berlin. Crowds gathered to welcome arrivals. Applause erupted. Strangers embraced. Within hours, other checkpoints followed. Some opened reluctantly. Others opened under mounting pressure. The wall had not been formally dismantled. No official decree declared its abolition. Yet its function, to prevent movement, had collapsed. It is important to recognize the complexity of that night. There was no premeditated revolution at the checkpoint. There was no coordinated military action. There was no dramatic confrontation between armed forces. There was miscommunication. There was hesitation. There was accumulation of public will. History often appears structured in hindsight. Events seem inevitable when examined retrospectively. But in real time, they unfold through uncertainty. The press conference had not been designed to end the wall. It had been intended to manage dissatisfaction. The phrase "effective immediately" was neither planned as a radical gesture nor prepared as a strategic shift. Yet language carries power. Once spoken publicly, words generate consequences. Once broadcast, they shape behavior. Citizens interpreted the statement as authorization. Border guards lacked instructions to contradict it decisively. Authority requires coherence. On that evening, coherence fractured. By midnight, thousands of East Berliners were crossing freely. Some returned home after brief visits. Others remained in the West for hours, exploring streets previously inaccessible. Many simply wanted to witness the reality for themselves. Concrete still stood physically intact. The wall was not demolished that night, but its meaning had changed irreversibly. The structure that had symbolized division for 28 years lost its operational control in a matter of hours. A press conference had become a turning point, not because of theatrical drama, but because, in a system already weakened by doubt and reform, ambiguity proved decisive. The wall still existed on maps, but on the ground, it no longer held. Chapter 5. The night the gates opened. The wall did not fall with an explosion. It opened. Late on the evening of the 9th of November 1989, the barriers at Bornholmer Strasse had already lifted. People were crossing cautiously, uncertain whether permission might suddenly be revoked. Yet as minutes passed and no reversal came, hesitation transformed into momentum. Across Berlin, word spread quickly. It's open. They're letting people through. The border is open. Telephones rang. Neighbors knocked on doors. Cars started. Trams filled. Citizens who had spent decades adjusting to restriction now moved with urgency toward checkpoints that had once symbolized impossibility. At Checkpoint, Charlie and other crossings, similar scenes unfolded. Border guards stood under floodlights, confronted not by aggression, but by expectation. They scanned passports. They stamped documents mechanically. In some locations, overwhelmed by numbers, they stopped checking entirely. Authority was not overthrown. It receded. On the western side, crowds gathered in increasing numbers. West Berliners approached the wall, uncertain at first whether the reports were accurate. When they saw familiar faces emerging from controlled zones, disbelief dissolved into celebration. Strangers embraced. Flowers appeared. Champagne bottles were opened. Car horns echoed through the night. Some East Berliners crossed briefly, only to return home before midnight. Others remained for hours, walking along streets they had previously observed only from a distance. They examined shop windows. They stood beneath neon lights. They absorbed the reality of unrestricted movement. It is important to understand that the wall still stood physically intact. Concrete segments remained fixed in place. Watchtowers were not dismantled. Soldiers were not disarmed. Yet the function of the wall, to prevent passage, had evaporated. By midnight, thousands had crossed. By early morning, tens of thousands. Television networks around the world broadcast live images. Viewers watched citizens climb onto the wall itself. Young people stood atop concrete slabs, waving flags and cheering. Some carried small hammers and chisels, chipping fragments from the surface. These individuals would later be called Mauerspechte, wall peckers. Their actions were symbolic rather than strategic. The wall was not structurally destroyed that night, but each small fragment removed signaled psychological rupture. Governments reacted cautiously. In Bonn, West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl monitored developments carefully. Reunification had long been a constitutional aspiration, but its timing had remained uncertain. Now, events were accelerating beyond prepared scenarios. In Washington, President George H.W. Bush adopted a measured tone. He avoided triumphant rhetoric. Stability remained a priority. The Cold War balance, though weakening, had not formally concluded. In Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev observed without intervention. Soviet forces stationed in East Germany remained in their barracks. The absence of military interference was itself decisive. The night unfolded without violence. This fact remains remarkable. Given decades of tension, armed border guards, and ideological hostility, the transition could have escalated unpredictably. Instead, restraint prevailed. Guards did not fire. Protesters did not attack. Political leaders did not mobilize force. History sometimes advances through confrontation. On this night, it advanced through permission. Permission not formally granted by decree, but created through collective action and institutional hesitation. By early morning on the 10th of November, Berlin had transformed. Traffic flowed in both directions. West Berliners traveled east. East Berliners traveled west. Public transportation adjusted rapidly to increased movement. Newspaper headlines were printed before dawn. The wall is open. Germany united in spirit. A historic breakthrough. Yet beneath the celebration lay complexity. Economic disparities did not disappear overnight. Political structures remained distinct. Currency systems differed. Legal frameworks were incompatible. Emotional reactions varied. For some East Germans, the opening produced exhilaration. For others, uncertainty emerged. What would reunification mean for employment? For identity? For social guarantees previously provided by the state? Euphoria and anxiety coexisted. Still, the symbolic power of the night was undeniable. The wall had represented immobility for 28 years. It had embodied ideological confrontation, enforced separation, and institutional rigidity. Now, ordinary citizens stood on top of it. Concrete that once prohibited movement became a platform for gathering. Barriers that had divided neighborhoods became meeting points. It would take months of negotiation before formal reunification occurred. Treaties would be signed. International agreements would be secured. Administrative integration would demand sustained effort. But the essential transformation occurred during those hours of spontaneous crossing. A structure designed to prevent choice lost its authority because people exercised choice collectively. No formal announcement declared the wall destroyed. No official ceremony initiated its collapse. Instead, a sequence of misunderstandings, public determination, and institutional restraint converged in a single night. By sunrise, Berlin was still geographically divided, but it was no longer psychologically confined. The gates had opened, and once opened, they would not close again. Chapter 6. The World Watches. By the morning of 10th November 1989, Berlin was no longer only a city. It had become a global image. Television cameras remained positioned along the wall. Journalists spoke into microphones while crowds moved behind them in continuous motion. Every crossing, every embrace, every fragment of chipped concrete was transmitted across continents. The fall of the wall was no longer a local event. It was an international turning point. Governments around the world responded carefully. In Bonn, the capital of West Germany at the time, Chancellor Helmut Kohl recognized both opportunity and responsibility. For decades, reunification had existed as a constitutional commitment, a long-term objective grounded in the belief that Germany remained one nation temporarily divided. Now, that possibility had accelerated unexpectedly. Kohl moved quickly but cautiously. He proposed a 10-point plan outlining gradual steps toward closer cooperation between East and West. His strategy emphasized stability, economic assistance, and eventual political unity. He understood that enthusiasm needed structure. Reunification required more than celebration. It required negotiation. In Washington, President George H.W. Bush adopted a restrained tone. He avoided triumphal declarations. The United States had supported West Berlin for decades, symbolizing resistance against Soviet expansion. Yet public celebration risked provoking instability within the Soviet Union. Bush's administration emphasized continuity and partnership rather than victory. In Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev faced complex pressures. The Soviet Union was undergoing its own transformation. Economic difficulties intensified. Political reform generated both support and resistance internally. Soviet troops remained stationed in East Germany. Their presence had long guaranteed the stability of the Eastern Bloc. Yet on that critical night, they did not intervene. This decision altered the course of history. Had Soviet forces acted, confrontation could have escalated rapidly. Instead, restraint signaled acceptance of change. Gorbachev chose negotiation over force, acknowledging that coercion would not restore legitimacy. Diplomacy intensified. The question was no longer whether the wall would reopen. That had already occurred. The question was how Europe would reorganize itself. The Cold War had structured global politics since the end of the Second World War. NATO and the Warsaw Pact stood as opposing alliances. Nuclear deterrence defined strategic thinking. Germany's division symbolized this confrontation. Now, the symbol was dissolving. European leaders gathered in urgent consultations. France and the United Kingdom approached the prospect of German reunification with caution. A larger Germany might alter the balance within Europe. Memories of earlier conflicts remained historically sensitive. Reunification required reassurance. Kohl and his foreign minister engaged in what became known as the 2+4 negotiations. The two German states, plus the four Allied powers that had occupied Germany after 1945, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. These negotiations addressed military alignment, borders, sovereignty, and security guarantees. They ensured that reunified Germany would remain within NATO while committing to peaceful integration. Diplomatic language replaced ideological confrontation. Meanwhile, inside Germany, economic realities demanded urgent action. The East German currency, the Ostmark, lacked convertibility and value compared to the West German Deutschmark. Infrastructure required modernization. State-owned enterprises faced exposure to market competition. Integration involved profound transformation. For East German citizens, the transition produced mixed emotions. The opening of the wall had generated exhilaration, yet economic restructuring introduced uncertainty. Factories closed. Employment patterns shifted. Social guarantees were renegotiated. Freedom expanded. Security changed. These processes were not instantaneous. They unfolded over months and years. On the 3rd of October 1990, less than a year after the wall opened, Germany was formally reunified. But formal unification did not eliminate difference. Cultural habits, economic conditions, and political perspectives varied across regions. The phrase inner unity emerged to describe the ongoing effort to integrate experience and identity. The world continued to observe. The fall of the Berlin Wall influenced developments beyond Germany. In Eastern Europe, reform movements accelerated. Regimes that had appeared permanent began to dissolve. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist. The geopolitical map of Europe was redrawn without large-scale military confrontation. This outcome was not inevitable. It resulted from restraint, negotiation, and the recognition that legitimacy cannot be sustained through force alone. The wall's collapse demonstrated that systems based on rigid separation are vulnerable when internal belief weakens and external support shifts. For decades, Berlin had symbolized division. Now, it symbolized transition. Concrete segments were gradually removed. Some were preserved as memorials. Others were transported abroad as artifacts of a concluded era. Yet the most significant transformation was intangible. The Cold War order, defined by confrontation and immobility, gave way to a new framework of interdependence and integration. History did not end. New tensions would emerge, new challenges would arise. But in November 1989, the world witnessed something rare. A profound geopolitical shift accomplished without large-scale violence. The wall had separated ideologies. Its fall required dialogue, and the world was watching as dialogue replaced division. Chapter 7: Memory and Meaning. After the cameras left, the city remained. The celebrations of November 1989 gradually gave way to construction sites, policy meetings, and quiet adjustments. The wall did not disappear overnight. Segments stood for months. Some were dismantled methodically. Others were removed by private individuals, preserved as souvenirs, or transported to museums abroad. Concrete, once immovable, became fragmented. But the physical removal of the wall was only one dimension of transformation. More complex was the removal of habits. For nearly 3 decades, 2 political systems had shaped daily experience differently. In the East, employment had been guaranteed by the state. Prices were controlled. Media narratives were unified. In the West, markets determined competition. Political pluralism structured debate. Consumer culture expanded rapidly. Reunification required merging not only territory, but expectations. Economic integration proceeded at remarkable speed. The introduction of the Deutschmark into East Germany created immediate change. Savings gained value. At the same time, state-owned enterprises struggled to compete under market conditions. Many factories closed. Unemployment, once nearly absent in official statistics, increased significantly. Opportunity expanded. Security shifted. For many East Germans, the early 1990s were characterized by ambivalence. Freedom of travel was unquestioned. Political participation widened. Yet the social guarantees that had structured life previously were no longer stable. Identity became a subject of reflection. The terms Aussie and Wessie entered informal vocabulary, distinguishing East and West Germans. These labels were often used humorously, but they revealed underlying perceptions. Cultural differences persisted in accent, professional networks, and political preferences. Reunification was legally completed in 1990. Inner unity required longer. Public memory began to institutionalize the past. Portions of the wall were preserved as memorial sites. The Berlin Wall Memorial at Bernauer Strasse documented the structure's evolution. The East Side Gallery transformed a remaining stretch into an open-air exhibition of murals. Museums collected documents from the Stasi archives. Citizens gained access to their personal files. They read reports written by acquaintances, colleagues, sometimes even relatives. Revelation generated complex reactions. Some experienced closure. Others encountered betrayal. The archival process demonstrated that history is not abstract. It is personal. Commemoration became part of civic culture. Anniversaries of the 9th of November were marked with speeches, exhibitions, and public discussions. Political leaders emphasized democratic values and European cooperation. The fall of the wall entered global vocabulary as a metaphor. It represented the end of ideological confrontation in Europe. It symbolized the capacity of peaceful protest to generate structural change. It illustrated that systems dependent on restriction cannot sustain themselves indefinitely when belief erodes. Yet, historical symbols risk simplification. The narrative of triumph can overshadow nuance. The lived experiences of transition were not uniformly celebratory. Economic disparities between Eastern and Western regions persisted for years. Infrastructure required investment. Political dissatisfaction occasionally resurfaced in different forms. Memory must balance recognition and realism. Berlin itself evolved visibly. Construction cranes reshaped skylines. Government institutions relocated from Bonn to Berlin, re-establishing it as the capital of a unified state. International companies established headquarters. Cultural festivals multiplied. The city that once embodied division became a symbol of reinvention. Visitors today walk along pathways that trace the former border. Lines embedded in pavement mark where concrete once stood. Tourists photograph fragments. Students study the Cold War in classrooms that stand near former checkpoints. The wall survives primarily as narrative. But narrative influences identity. For younger generations born after 1990, the wall is historical rather than experiential. They encounter it through textbooks, documentaries, and family stories. Their understanding is shaped by interpretation rather than direct memory. This distance introduces responsibility. How should division be remembered? As warning? As lesson? As completed chapter? History rarely concludes absolutely. New borders appear. Political tensions evolve. Societies continue to negotiate inclusion and exclusion. The Berlin Wall reminds observers that separation can appear permanent until circumstances shift. It demonstrates that legitimacy cannot rely solely on enforcement. It reveals that peaceful collective action can reshape political structures when combined with institutional restraint. But it also cautions that integration demands sustained effort. Reunification was not the end of history. It was a transition within it. Today, fragments of the wall stand in cities far beyond Germany. They function as artifacts, physical reminders of ideological rigidity and eventual transformation. Concrete can be dismantled. Trust requires cultivation. The fall of the wall changed Europe's political architecture. Its memory continues to influence debates about borders, sovereignty, and democratic resilience. In Berlin, the skyline no longer reflects division. Yet beneath the surface, history remains present, not as barrier, but as reference. The wall has fallen. Its meaning continues to evolve. Chapter 8. Beyond the Wall. It shifts. The night the Berlin Wall opened felt decisive, almost cinematic. Crowds crossed, barriers lifted, concrete was chipped away beneath floodlights. The world watched, yet the true meaning of that night unfolded gradually, across years and across borders. When the wall fell, it marked not only the transformation of Germany, but the beginning of a broader redefinition of Europe. Political systems that had appeared immovable began to dissolve. Alliances were reconsidered. Institutions adapted. The Cold War, once structured by rigid confrontation, moved toward conclusion. But what replaced it was not simplicity. In the 1990s, optimism dominated much of public discourse. The language of a new Europe circulated widely. Integration deepened. The European Union expanded eastward. Formerly divided societies joined common institutions. Economic cooperation intensified. The expectation was clear. Openness would prevent future division. Yet history is dynamic. Integration produces opportunity, but also tension. Economic globalization connected markets more closely than ever before. Technological advancement accelerated communication. Borders became more permeable to trade, ideas, and migration. These developments required negotiation. Germany, now reunified, became a central actor within Europe. Berlin re-established itself as a political capital. The country balanced memory of its past with responsibility in the present. Its foreign policy emphasized cooperation and multilateralism. The memory of division influenced these choices. The wall had demonstrated the fragility of systems dependent on force. It had revealed that legitimacy arises from consent rather than coercion. It had shown that peaceful civic action, when combined with institutional restraint, can redirect history. These lessons extended beyond Germany. In subsequent decades, new barriers emerged elsewhere, physical and political. Debates about sovereignty, migration, and security resurfaced across continents. Societies confronted questions of identity and inclusion. Global crises tested cooperation. The fall of the wall became both inspiration and warning. Inspiration, because it affirmed the possibility of transformation without large-scale violence. Warning, because division can reappear in different forms. For younger generations, the wall belongs to history. They encounter it through documentaries, textbooks, and preserved fragments displayed in public squares. They walk along lines in Berlin's pavement that mark where concrete once stood. To them, division may seem distant. Yet the underlying questions remain contemporary. How do societies balance security and freedom? How do governments maintain legitimacy? How do citizens participate in shaping political direction? The events of 1989 did not resolve these dilemmas permanently. They demonstrated that resolution is possible, but not guaranteed. Berlin today is vibrant, diverse, and outward-looking. Its architecture reflects layers of history: imperial monuments, wartime scars, Cold War relics, modern glass facades. The city's transformation embodies resilience. But resilience requires maintenance. Democracy depends on engagement. Integration depends on dialogue. Cooperation depends on trust. The wall fell because belief in its necessity eroded. Enforcement alone could not preserve it. External support shifted. Citizens acted collectively. Leaders exercised restraint. These conditions converged. Such convergence is rare. The broader lesson of 1989 is not that history inevitably moves toward openness. It is that openness demands participation. Systems must adapt to remain legitimate. Institutions must respond to social change rather than suppress it indefinitely. Beyond the wall lies responsibility. Responsibility to remember accurately, neither romanticizing nor simplifying. Responsibility to recognize that stability can conceal tension. Responsibility to understand that division often emerges gradually before it becomes visible. The fall of the Berlin Wall represents one of the 20th century's defining transitions. It closed an era shaped by ideological confrontation and initiated a period of reconfiguration. But it did not end conflict. History continued. New challenges emerged: economic crises, geopolitical rivalries, technological disruptions. Each required negotiation rather than nostalgia. The wall's fragments now stand in museums and public spaces worldwide. They function as reminders that boundaries, however solid they appear, are products of political decisions, and political decisions can change. The story of the Berlin Wall is not solely about its construction or its fall. It is about the conditions that sustain systems, and the moments when those conditions dissolve. Concrete can divide territory. Only trust can unite societies. The wall has fallen. The question that remains is how future generations will respond when confronted with new walls, visible or invisible, in their own time.